The newest knife to my collection is the Steadfast 3.25 inch. I'd call it a belt knife from Steve Kalari Custom Knives. This is the first knife that I've bought in a while, and it's also one that I've also decided to implement my new style of testing with. Comes with a nice leather sheath. I prefer waistband carry, but if you got a great cutting tool, I think you could work around whatever sheath or whatever carry options. Steve, you know him as Supersteel Steve. He's on Instagram. He's done some YouTube. I know he wanted to switch over to Rumble, but I don't think too many people followed that. However, I was always interested in testing out. At first it was chef cut, but this knife actually comes in CPM 154 at 64 Rockwell, 10,000 behind the edge. Not exactly a laser beam, but thin enough, strong enough to do a lot of detail work. Blade shape, I'd consider it very neutral, but for an EDC fixed blade, you really don't know what tasks you might perform, so having something neutral, I think, is a good thing. Now, the knife itself allowed me to actually entertain a new style of testing that I've been kind of developing. Now, if we flash back last year, I was using sanding rolls as my cut testing. I freehand my edges. I only test my edges. I know if you want to get more scientific, one could always use a fixed angle system. To me, I was just doing it for the pure fun of just seeing what my edges actually do holding up. Now, one of the things that I've experimented will probably last August, but never continued on because life kind of got in the way. I took a simple steel like H1 and I cut tested it on the sanding rolls like how I normally do, and I got a set value. It's been a while and I don't remember what that value actually is. If I recall, it might have been 55, which actually matches utility razors. And since I always felt draw cutting doesn't mimic real life as much, and it's the most ideal condition, I believe there's a disconnect between cut testing and real world usage. So I started implementing, I tried out, instead of draw cuts, chop cuts on a block of ice. Because if you're cutting crossways, downways, I think that kind of somewhat blends in how the natural cutting motion of most tasks actually are. Steve, he's got a background in culinary, and so obviously he's seen firsthand in the kitchen, or at least I'm not an expert, but having big, larger chef knives, the different styles of cutting that are performed throughout the day, whether it's rocking cuts, dices. Yes, you use a much larger blade, especially if you're in a professional kitchen. This is just my theory. Steve can obviously correct me because ignorance. I haven't worked in a professional kitchen. He has for quite a few years. But I feel that there's been a disconnect in actual testing, especially with controlled cut testing, because you're living in a bubble it's not mimicking real world usage. Unless you work in a bubble. I mean, the world is not always sunshine and rainbows. What I found with the ice chopping on a steel like H1 was that the ratio was 1-to-1. I did the 55 chops or however many it was, and the entire edge, the apex itself, it blunted the same way, the same amount of strokes, whether it was sanding rolls or whether it was ice chops. H1 is notorious for being quote unquote tough. However, what I realized was I could use a combination of both in my testing, and that would actually bridge the gap between controlled cut testing and a more realistic approach to what average users, field users can expect. This was the first knife I actually tested with that. I went with a 4-to-1 ratio. So first, I used up the edge that Steve actually put on here. I got a great result. I posted it on my Instagram. However, I only compare myself against myself. So I will say that his number performed phenomenally. Right around what I achieved for S90V, if you actually want to go back through my Instagram and double check. The controlled cut testing results I got was 460 on the CPM 154. You can see some scratches on there. Obviously, you can see his logo. I know, Steve, the main version is 3.5 inch. I've seen him drop a 3 inch now. Obviously, Steve is notorious for, well, I'm going to say kitchen blades. However, something like an EDC fixed blade, you buy it from Steve Kalari, obviously for his heat treats, his grinds, and obviously I'm pretty sure he's offering models that could fit everybody's personal preferences, whether it's a kitchen use, everyday carry. Steve seems to be getting better and better as the months go on. The 460 cuts that I actually achieved on this knife, and I do my best to eliminate overall geometry into the equation. I've tested razor blades, I've tested straight razors. My style of testing tries hard to eliminate the overall geometry of the blade profile, just the edge angle, the steel itself, and its resistance to deformation. In this style of testing, 2 different dulling mechanisms. I don't see that on YouTube. I really don't see that anywhere. And obviously, you could play around with the ratios if you wanted to. So what I did with the 460 cuts was I did some math. Now, if you think 460 cuts is something to laugh at, that's exactly what I got on my Spyderco K390 testing that I did 6 or 8 months ago. I took the 460 cuts and I did 40% of that, which I believe was 184 sanding roll cuts. And then I did 92 chops on my ice block. Now my ice block, I take 3 bottles of tap water. I fill up a bread loaf pan and I throw it in the freezer for about 24 hours. What I found with that H1 testing is just normal chops covers the entire length of the edge pretty well. And in my style of cut testing, I'd rather not tape off the edge. I'd rather use the whole thing because I feel the handle, the edge, the sheath, it all works in unison. It's all part of the teamwork that comes in with carrying knives. And I did 92 chops on an ice block outside. I did some other testing, which I'll get into shortly. And then I did more sanding roll cuts to finish off the duration of testing to get an average. Now, a soft, or maybe not, that's not the right word, but a steel that has acceptable amount of toughness is still going to actually hold up to that 460 cut number. I count the chops as actual cuts, so it would continue on. The final result that I actually got was 385, which is about an 84% of what I got from controlled cut testing. I like to set my edge angles slightly lower than most people. I freehand them, so there is some convexity into the edges themselves. However, if you're really going to actually test steels, in my opinion, you really need to start pushing the geometry, some thresholds, and really testing to see what it could actually do. The obvious solution, if this was getting really low numbers, is to raise up the edge angle, maybe to 15, maybe to 17 degrees, because you know your steel, the heat treat on it, can support your edge angles. It's a simple solution. I enjoy testing knives. That way I can actually articulate and discuss, because some people, they could say, hey, I like this CTS B70P, but they really don't have any qualitative and quantitative numbers to actually back up some of the reasons or some of the actual factual numbers that they have. I know I've been talking with Sal Glesser on Spyderco about my testing style. And obviously, this was only just 20% chopping. Depending on the knife, you may actually want to do higher numbers. You may want to do lower numbers. You may want to incorporate ice block testing with, maybe doing 2 cycles of 15%. Just so you can get a better idea of what the steel can actually do when you start blurring the lines between real world and controlled cut testing. Now, 385 is roughly about an 84% drop, or an 84% expectancy of what I got with my own edge on there. The edge that it actually came with came very, very close. I'd say probably around 98% of that. Very happy with how this was heat treated, Steve. I know you do make laser beams, but 10th thou behind the edge is perfectly fine for me, especially if you want to carry this and even give it to other people. I know it's got, I'd consider that a moderate amount of toughness. Now, super tough steels are going to hold up exactly to the edge retention numbers, but being at 84%, I find is very acceptable. got the burlap micarta. Let's see the liners. Overall size, it's a great EDC belt carry knife. I have no complaints. I enjoyed testing it. Now, while I was talking with Sal Glesser at Spyderco, I was trying to tell him about my approach to testing on the Mule Forum. And just because I feel like Sal is much like everybody else, they've only done it linearly, where they have a dedicated start point, a media that they actually cut, they take the final figure, and that's that. Catra does have its usage, and my cutting on the sanding roll is my variation of Catra testing in a lot of ways. But when you start compounding other variables, other dulling mechanisms, I think you get a better picture of what real world usage would actually translate to. Now, something like this B70P is quite similar in a lot of ways, composition-wise, to CPM 154. However, this is a custom heat treat that's dialed in very well. If Steve is getting this on CPM 154, I have to recommend that you look at not just his CPM 154, but other steels that he actually heat treats as well. High likelihood that you're going to get a phenomenal product that's going to push well beyond its what everybody believes it can actually do. Now, this mule, I think, has been overshadowed by the Spy 27 offering that is out right now. Spy 27 does everything I wanted B70P to actually do. However, explaining it to Sal about my testing style, even though I have dozens of them, I wanted to make a forum post or a thread explaining what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and hopefully it translates to better, what's the right word? A better evaluation of how we perceive steels. My edge received 120 cuts with this B70P mule. 460 cuts. There is a world of difference between the two. Now, operating under the 4-to-1 ratio or the 40-20-40, 40% cutting, 20% chops, 40% cutting, and see where the numbers actually line up. I did 48 cuts on the sanding roll with the mule. Another 24 chops on ice. And I got some more cutting to reach the final number of 105. So 105 out of 120. Roughly around 87% of what the controlled cut test numbers actually were. Now, because I had that ice block and I wanted to get more usage out of it because 24 chops is really not going to affect it. Obviously, you could have parameters set with what type of water you freeze. You can use distilled water. You could throw additives in there. I'm just taking it from the tap. So I decided to retest this Polestar and BD1N as well. Now, when I tested the Polestar a while ago, I got 300 cuts on the sanding roll. So I used that figure, did the 20% testing style, which is going to be my testing style for the at least the near future. It's always subject to change. I'm always looking at different ways to properly evaluate steel. because, well, frankly, the videos that I see on YouTube nowadays are quite cringeworthy. And I'm not saying I'm no pro at this, but I feel the content that some of these people are creating, I think they're more interested in prostituting themselves than actually providing data that's actually useful for the average Joe or Jane. Now, the BD1N, I know Spyderco uses it on some of their kitchen knives. I don't have any experience with that. But on the Polestar, this BD1N, I got 300 cuts on the strictly the sanding roll 6 or 8 months ago, whenever it actually was. Now, when I went to do my newest style of testing, I got 120 cuts on the sanding roll. I did 60 chops on the block of ice. And when I went to go test the edge before starting the second portion of the sanding roll cuts, the apex flatlined. 180 out of a possible 300. This is just my own testing. These are my own samples. I don't have the ability to test, 10 or 15 samples. I only test what I buy, what I use. My goal is to find enjoyment out of every single knife that I own. And this is just sort of a fun thing for me to do on the side. Testing knives. That drop in performance tells me one or two things. Number one, the edge angle is too low to support what I would consider a moderate workload. When knives get dull, or when you really start challenging in the cuts, lateral stresses come into play, and I feel that there's no good way to actually test that currently. I'm always brainstorming about different ideas, different approaches to actually provide what I would hope is useful data to anybody that really watches my videos. As far as buying at least CPM 154 from Steve Kalari Custom Knives, I would highly recommend looking into it. Whether you're looking into a everyday kind of carry blade or even some of his kitchen knives, he's a maker that I think is doing a fantastic job. His heat treats are spot on. His grinds are spot on. I think he's got enough variety for anybody who's looking for something specific. Anyways, that's all I got for today. Have a nice day.